So we will go ahead and start. Anyways, this is cellular exploitation on a global scale, rise and fall of the control protocol. Focus of this talk is analyzing the carrier-mandated remote control and management functionality. Pretty much, carriers are inserting some interesting different functionality into phones, and we are going to discuss what we found in it, the security issues, different vulnerabilities, and try to demonstrate how over-the-air code execution can be obtained on what we're estimating to be close to 2 billion devices. Who we are, I'm Matthew Solonick. We both are security scientists at Acuant Labs. This is Mark Blanchard. How the research began. So, what was it? A little bit late last year, I was doing something I don't really know many people do. I was actually reading a manual for a little M10 device, and in there it said, if you've got these devices already deployed in field and you forgot to turn on remote control, more or less, remote console on your little M10, please call your manufacturer and carrier and they can turn it on. I was like, what? And that started me down a road that is landing up here. So we will start with the rise of the control protocol. We're going to go into an overview of carrier controls. So, current standard, OME device management. It's an amalgamation of prior standards which have been used, such as like OME CP and OME SP. There was actually a talk in Black Hat 2009 on OME CP called Hijacking Mobile Data Connections. Good talk, definitely recommend checking it out. This new protocol, though, is now currently deployed on over 2 billion devices, according to stats we found online. It's an interesting client. More or less, the carriers define the requirements of it. If they want it to do X or Y, they give that to the manufacturers. The manufacturers then implement whatever the requirements they ask for. So sometimes it's very minor, just real basic stuff. Sometimes a little bit more. And each implementation is different, sort of. So in OME device management, we have what are called management objects, which provide different feature sets. The carriers will say, I want X, Y, or Z, or all of the above. Some of the interesting ones we've seen are FUMO, standard firmware over-the-air management. If any of y'all run Androids, especially if you're running them via a carrier-provided device, say you bought your device from any of the major US or worldwide carriers, and you do a photo update. If it's not going over GOTA, Google's OTA, which most aren't, it is probably going over OME-DM. Then we also have things like Conmo, which is pretty standard, allows the carriers to remotely reconfigure, basic network settings, things like APNs, all the, weird carrier stuff. But there are some interesting parts in that. Then we start to get into a little bit more interesting feature sets. LAMO. So LAMO provides remote lock, wipe, factory reset capability. What that really means is that new standard in 2015 that has to be all phones have remote lock capability. Looks like this was going to be it. DCMO, Diagmon, SCOMO. Talk a little bit more about those later. So we're going to go into a little bit on device and client information. Current devices with OME-DM that we have found. iOS. iOS has it on Sprint only. Android. In the US, most major carriers. We can guarantee 3 out of the 4 usually have it. So if any of y'all have a major carrier device from this list, please make sure it is turned off. We are running live base stations. BlackBerry, Windows Mobile, we'll talk a little bit about that later. So it's also in hotspots, laptops, M10, and IoT basebands. It's an interesting spot because they are now trying to standardize on OMADM and an OMADM derivative to be the new device management standard for IoT and M10 devices, which we like because it includes cars. So, embedded client locations. We're going to talk about where the code actually runs. So, pretty much on phones, this code lives in userland, mostly. So we have a component that's living in userland, usually has a direct-to-baseband interface, though, like privileged, much higher than any standard app would usually have. On embedded M10 devices, the code actually runs directly in the baseband. You know, we've got a carrier-controlled piece of code running directly in your baseband. Now, other devices, it really depends on kind of where everything is. You know, I've seen it on hotspots where it's in the baseband. I've seen it where it's in userland, some mixes, partially. Can't quite tell. So, let's give a little bit of a history lesson. Reference toolkit. Most OMA devices, or clients, are actually built on what's called the SyncML reference toolkit. It's an open source toolkit, was originally meant to be a proof of concept released by the SyncML OMA back in like 2003, 2004. It's pretty much the core code base for all of the clients we have found, and it was last updated in 2004. So if y'all's devices are running it, there are some tweaks, but it's kind of interesting. And one more thing. We found one vendor is the primary vendor of nearly all OMA clients in the world, between 70 and 90% market share. It's Redbend Software. Redbend vDirect Mobile, OMA DM client. It's based on the SyncML toolkit, just like we talked about earlier. It's pretty much provided as a binary blob to all manufacturers for the most part. That includes baseband manufacturers. In other words, they do not know exactly what they're getting. And we found that kind of interesting. So, a couple of things to note for later. There are two primary release versions, V4 and V5. Both are still heavily used, and not sure the reasoning for the choices between the two, but it is important for later. One thing to note about Redbend, they are heavily promoting SCOMO for automotive ECU updates. A small picture of Redbend-enabled devices. Now, this picture may not be up to date, but we found it on their website and thought it would be a pretty cool thing. So, rise of the control protocol. Detailed analysis. We're going to go talk about the network design and communications. So, pretty much what happens is when the carriers want the devices to communicate, they will send typically a WAP push to the clients. WAP push hits the SMS gateways, WAP gateways, over the networks to the client. Depending on the actual content type, it will, more or less wake up the client, tell it to connect back, or actually do configuration management. We'll go into that a little bit more later, but it's actually fairly simplistic in the overall architecture. It's when it gets into the nitty-gritty that's a little bit more interesting. Okay. You want to talk about some security? Go for it. So I'm going to hand it over to Mark to talk a little bit about security that standard in. Do you have it there? I don't know.
So the standard describes some security, had a security standard, so the OMADM security 1.2. So they had mutual authentication required with digest or HMAC MD5. This is based on a secret and a client ID. It also requires transport layer authentication if there is no if there is no transport layer authentication, each request must be authenticated. I'm sorry. What also is optional is the integrity and the transport layer encryption. So this protocol was designed to be mostly secure, I guess, for the authentication part, and the other components are optional. So it was kind of the choice of the implementation to have those features.
Okay. Take it back over. So we're going to talk about a few of the different initial over-the-air payload types. So we have 3 major types. One, what's called a network-initiated alert. Pretty much it is a very small set of data that just wakes up the client, tells it phone home. We have another one called DM Bootstrap. More or less on certain devices, this allows the carrier to completely push its own config at any time, anywhere, and it's used to just configure the client. Then we have what's called CP Bootstrap, which is a harken back to OME CP days. It also can be used to reconfigure the client. Though we found most carriers, at least in the US, are not using DM and CP Bootstrap, except for one. So here is an example of what an NIA payload looks like. More or less, it's just broken up into different PDU chunks. We have version, UI mode. UI mode is kind of interesting. So in UI mode, that's where you define if you alert the user to its presence. There are 3 different configuration settings, and one is alert user, other is completely quiet. Goes into session ID, the length, pretty standard stuff, server identifier. Also, there's the digest, which Mark kind of talked about a little bit earlier, the different kinds of authentication. So you didn't include the digest in there. And it can be delivered on just about any kind of bearer type. So that includes standard GSM to CDMA, LT, you name it. Anywhere, you can do it over OBEX if you want. Okay, now we have DM Bootstrap. So we're not going to do CP, but I figure we'll go into DM Bootstrap a little bit. Again, it is used for initial device provisioning and re-provisioning. You can see the binary representation. It's called WBXML. And then the syncML representation is what we just converted it back to. Make it a little bit easier to understand. So we will now hop into client-side analysis. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about how the OMA DM clients actually run. What happens with them? So server will send more or less a WBXML payload to the client. Clients have what are called a DM tree. You can kind of see the example up there. What it is pretty much like a configuration file combined with like settings as well as what you can actually run. It's a little bit harder to describe, but if you more or less export different items into this tree, you can then run them. So the URIs that you would export, example, like LAMO, operations lock. Standard commands, we have get, alert, replace, delete, copy, exec. There's some more, but those are the main interesting ones. Now let's go into some of the nitty-gritty of the client-side parsing. On the surface layer, it's actually not too bad. Once you start getting into it, then we start seeing the fun stuff. So I'm going to walk you through the different portions of parsing. All starts at cellular. RF comes in, baseband will parse RF data, whether it's WAPs, PDUs, IMS, whatever. Baseband will then pass that to user land, either via an AT or QMI type connection. Usually it'll pass data and the metadata around that. OS then re-parses that data. So it has to figure out, okay, baseband tells me something, I need to verify it, who do I send this to? In Android System Core would typically do that. It gets the data from the RIL, then we'll send an intent to whatever OMA-DM client you have on your device. And on iOS, it all comes into Comm Center. Comm Center then passes some information via Mac ports and XPC to something called DM Helper. From there, we have two different package types or payload types. Package 0 we'll start with, which we kind of talked about a little bit earlier with the OTA bootstrap mechanisms. That's like DM bootstrap or NIAs. It goes down into WBXML, gets decoded to syncML, then finally down to DM bootstrap and whatever sub-DTDs. So what sub-DTDs allow it to do a bunch more things that weren't built into the original client. Then once the initial over-the-air payload has been delivered, it goes into package 1+. From there, we hop into transport layer. Now it gets a little bit easier to play with because most of the transport layers are HTTPS based. So more or less, WBXML over HTTP. And that'll usually be shot up back to whatever carrier network and back to the carrier servers. Under that, it has syncML, your base OMA-DM DTDs, as well as sub-DTDs, such as like devinfo, metainfo, TNDS, etc. So let's talk a little bit about our testing and tools. So talk about our cellular testing hardware. We are big fans of Nano BTS and the OpenBSC project. It is really, really good code. Hard to describe how clean that is. It has an awesome built-in SMPP interface. So if you want to do anything with WAP or SMS, definitely recommended. Also have a USERP B210. Not very good if you want to be pushing heavy amounts of odd data through it. You'll have a lot of stability issues, whatever. And then femtocells. Femtocells are really fun. So go into some more. That's pictures of part of our lab and some of the devices. We have a couple femtocells there, the USERPs, our Nano BTS, which we are currently running. So again, please turn off your phones. About half of our test phones are there, and we have some other ones that we had to censor out right now. So, testing tools, identifying control clients. So let's talk about how you can identify if your phone has this. On iOS, profile different services that are communicating with Comm Center. So that would require a jailbroken device. I would recommend getting one that you can re-jailbreak a few times. We'll talk about that one later. BlackBerry, a little bit harder. Actually, the person who helped me with that is in the room, Ben Nell. He was able to help me figure out how to play in the radio Q CFM bars, which contain some interesting data. You can definitely find what you're looking for there. Windows Mobile, I would say just read the docs. They have the most heavily documented protocol or implementation of OMADM that we have seen, but that's also why we didn't really spend much time on it. We figured that if it's that documented, they know what they're doing. Now Android. Android is a little bit of a pain because it can be anywhere on this guy. Renamed, how it's inserted, it's everywhere and nowhere. So what we recommend is identify any services that receive WAP data or raw data SMS or just SMS themselves. We've seen OMA clients, mostly older ones from a few years ago, that actually would receive and take control commands via SMS. Nowadays, mostly other rare types, but also audit anything with services directly to the RIL. So RIL, radio, or any other kind of direct baseband access, usually leveraging the items listed there. So one thing you will notice is SecRel client. Take note of that. Okay, so let's talk about embedded devices. On embedded devices, usually just easiest to start reverse engineering the baseband firmware itself. Throw it in IDA, see what you can see. Take a bunch of time, but usually get fairly decent results. IDA's gotten pretty good today. Easy way to narrow it down. Anything that contains WAP sync amount or WBXML strings, you usually find it pretty quickly. If you aren't able to get easy access to firmware, recommend tracing any kind of UART communications. Stick it on to whatever network it's supposed to be on, and just watch all traffic going across UART. If you have to, leverage JTAG, but you start getting into a little bit more shaky area and trying to track down all that data will be a bit of a pain. And BTS-based testing. A lot of these devices, if you stick them on your BTS and configure it the right way, they'll start communicating just like their home network. It's pretty easy to identify when these packets are getting shot. You can look at it in Wireshark. Okay, simulating cellular environments. Mark, why don't you take this one?
Yeah, so we had to do some modifications on the phones themselves to be able to test more easily. Cellular environments are very slow. It's hard to test. When you send a lot of payloads, it tends to create issues, overload the network. You can't really fuzz easily. So we created those tools that allow hooking some specific functions to make the phone believe it is on a cellular environment, whereas it's actually running over Wi-Fi. So basically everything the phone checks to make sure it's, or to determine the network type, which is dependent on the application or system-wide, are functions that are hooked and allow really testing over Wi-Fi and sending heavy payloads. We also had a few tools to fuzz the application via WAP messages without actually using a cellular environment, without even using Wi-Fi. So we are just sending WAP messages from the application itself to itself, or from another application to the application, so that we could really simulate the exact same thing as what the application would receive when it would receive a WAP message.
Go for it.
So we also used a few tools to trace system applications. So this specific tool that you can see here, Android Tracer, is based on Introspy Android. The default behavior of the original tool was just to test all of the different security-sensitive APIs, monitor them, make sure the calls are secure, make sure they don't do any things that could compromise the security of the application. And so we extended that to be able to trace application in depth. So we added a call graph with different ways to profile applications. So basically all of the calls the application makes are listed. You have different layers that are displayed within the graph. And it's really, really helpful for doing reverse engineering. So we run that over all of the applications on the device, all of the system applications, everything. And we try to see the different interactions between the applications. In addition to that, we added features to log as much as possible, have it run all day to make sure we got everything the applications on the device were doing. So this specific application uses Exposed and CDA substrate. So those are two hooking frameworks. The original application where it's based off only used CDA substrate, but they tended to not work very well on some devices. So we ported it to Exposed, and we now use both of them, which is really powerful. Some of the features CDA substrate can miss or have bug with, Exposed can compensate for that, and the other way around. So it was really useful to do that.
Okay, I'll take it back over. Okay, let's talk about some actual attack platforms. So, just standard cellular network attacks. You know, these are kind of your run-of-the-mill, everyday attacks. Luckily, in the US, you're going to be pretty much protected. Worldwide, you might have a little more issues, but kind of different attacks that you might run into. Device-to-device WAP push. Pretty standard. Send a WAP from one device to another. You can do it with apps. Now you have to know what to send, but can definitely be done. Third-party WAP push interfaces. These are interfaces that carriers provide to third parties, say, to send out any kind of WAP message or SMS, like these huge SMS gateways. Most of them have been shut down, but not all of them. Again, US carriers, safer from. Worldwide, you want to turn this off. Now, MTAM, that's a bit of a different beast. We're talking devices without phone numbers. They don't have standard SIM card setups, so they don't really need a phone card, cell phone number either. They use UDP. You can literally send these devices UDP packets to activate them. It's pretty much like a WDP over UDP. Interesting stuff, but now LTE, that is a different beast in itself. Completely new style network designs. You know, we have IMS, SIP. They're like big data networks. Used to be kind of cellular style. Now it is more or less voice over data. The whole layout is a lot more like the standard wired networks or the internet. There's a lot of new attack surfaces there, and there's going to be a lot to keep an eye out for. So let's go into our favorite stuff. Rogue base station attacks. Pretty much because we do not test on carrier networks, we have respect for them. We only do our testing on base stations. So these are the kind of different attacks that can happen with someone with a base station, which we have a few of right here. More or less, something interesting we found is our old 2.5G base station can attack a lot of y'all's high-end global LTE devices. Even if the home network was set to LTE CDMA. Found by jamming the LTE and CDMA frequencies, we can get the phones to drop down to 2.5G. More or less, that's edge with data. But to do that, we have to broadcast weird cellular configs and some interesting neighboring information. They get confused, drop down. GSM devices, more stable, LTE, CDMA, they start to get a little funny, but if you work fast, it doesn't really matter. Now, one of the little tips I like to give, be a good neighbor. If you leverage multiple BTSs, you will get a much higher camping rate. That means big issue with anyone who's played with cellular devices is keeping the phones connected to your BTS or getting them there. run lots of BTSs or make it think like you do. You more or less set up your own carrier network, not just a BTS. By feeding the BTS information across this network, the phones get so much data from rogue BTSs that they just think that's right data, and they don't really know any better. It's no longer just getting one false BTS base station. Now, we can go into one more area, femtocells. These, if you're willing to get into it, are one of the most stable platforms you can use. They're probably higher tech than what you already have if you have BTS, unless you have like a lot of money, which we don't, and have LTE BTSs. These guys are usually 3G. They can let you play with things like CDMA. Whatever networks you need on, they can usually provide an interface to. We like to use them and program our own backends for them, more or less make them think that they are on a network when they really are on ours. So we don't have to mess with carriers. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit more. But before we actually go into this, we've kind of gone into what the carriers have. You know, we gave you a brief overview of the different kind of functionalities. You know, that includes the device management portions of, you know, actual capability of the phone to FOTA times SCOMO, if you also list, direct baseband changes, you name it. Unfortunately, can't say which devices have full feature sets, but carriers have a lot of functionality built in. More or less, pretty much an MDM. Not quite, but because I've never seen an MDM that can reconfigure your baseband. So let's actually go into some of these vulnerabilities. Core authentication. So, like we talked about earlier, the carriers or OMA-DM is based on a combination of a device identifier and a shared secret token. So, carrier's implementation uses your device ID as your MEI or your MEID, which is interesting. It also uses a shared secret token. Now, between that two pieces of information, an attacker with direct access to the client can take full control. Now, IMEIs and MEIDs are not public or not sensitive information. They are broadcast publicly over more or less cellular network at all times. The device IMEID or IMEI and MEID is also the client's username. Now, the shared secret token, the secret sauce to the password. Well, it's a combination of the IMEI and a static key across all the carrier devices. So your only security is your IMEI, because that token is hard-coded on each one of your devices. Oh, and the authentication can be downgraded from any high-end back to actually basic, which was not even in the OMA 2.1 standard. It is a throwback to a previous, which means that it's just a base 64 of your username and password that gets sent out. Now, we found some really interesting vulnerabilities in transport and encryption. Why don't you go into that, Mark?
Yeah, so when the device uses a transport layer security, which is most phones, the SSL can be, the SSL certificate verification is very weak. The code you can see at the top right is what you can see on a large number of devices. It's a class that allows, that overrides the default hostname verifier for SSL certificates. So basically, any valid certificate can be having any hostname and would be able to man in the middle of the connection. So they just overrode this. They originally overrode this to implement certificate pinning. They had some features where you would inject your certificate. So this code is pushed to different platforms, and each manufacturers or company implementing the code would have their own certificate in one of the directory, and most of them don't. So it defaults to this hostname verifier classes, and they validate basically any certificate, any valid certificate delivered for any hostname. So you can basically man the middle most of the connections for the transport security. In addition to that, they have insecure test, HTTP test server left in their DM tree, which is one of the configuration files they use. And one of the problems with that, whereas in itself, if you just see that in a file, you say, so they just left the HTTP server, the test server, and there are no worries with that. The problem is the protocol is designed so that by sending a WAP message, a WAP NIA to a device, you can make it choose a certain network. So by default, you have the secure one using HTTPS, but you can also force it to choose this unsecure test server that is using HTTP. So basically, by just sending a web message to any device, you would be able to force it to go over HTTP and basically manage the middle of the connection, and then that's it. You can just interact as the server and do whatever you want.
Yeah.
You have as much control as a client on the device.
So well, let me go into that a little bit more. We have pretty much one manufacturer or writer of this code, 70 to 90% market share. They also have somehow test servers on who knows how many devices. With a single WAP push, not your carrier can access the full functionality of your device. That does not require base station, any kind of man in the middle. All it requires is access to send one WAP push. Oh, and it doesn't even verify the MEID in the WAP push itself. So, not sure why one company has this, considering they're not the ones managing it, but it's not for me to figure out. Oh, the sample we have on there is from a Google Nexus 5, Android 4.4.4, multiple months after we have done responsible disclosure. This is a XML config file. We are not sure why it's still there. So let's go into abusing some of the standard functionality. So I'm going to talk about some of the interesting things you can do just the standard functionality. One thing I liked is if you're having to use proximity attacks, so have to get a base station pretty close, you can then do persistent man in the middle. More or less reconfigure different device settings to always go over proxies or APNs, different kind of routes that you want. And depending on the device itself, many of these settings will get written into baseband, including into the NVRAM itself, the EFS. So more or less, you factory reset, you still can't get rid of it. So other interesting portions, it allows us to modify your preferred roaming lists, your home networks, anything that you are seeing on your device, we can tell it otherwise. You think you're connecting to one carrier and you are connecting to someone else. You think your route is going through standard gateways, and it is not. And these are usually settings that you have no access to whatsoever, especially on lockdown devices. So let's go into another interesting thing we found. Carrier customizations. So not only do carriers have OMA-DM, they have an extra set of customizations in it. Pretty much, we've found that it's called Chameleon. It's mostly on one carrier in the US, but provides a lot of interesting functionality. such as call intercept. What that does is allow them to redirect any number you dial to an application of their choice. So more or less, can be used as an intent proxy if you wanted to. Then it also controls device self-service, which some of you may know, some of you may not. Other applications that are on the device provided by the carrier. Then we have things like voicemail. Interesting. There's some interesting code in there. I strongly recommend any of y'all running Android to take a look at your vms.apk and tell me what you think. So, another interesting portion. Inside-out baseband attacks. We have a privileged interface to the baseband. We're able to modify the NVRAM, EFS, and other low-level parameters. Some of this data is passed via the EMCC, or EMMC. That's the carrier partition. So y'all may remember the guy from Cyanogen wasn't quite wrong, wasn't quite right, but it's kind of on the right track. It can be leveraged both ways. The radio can write to it, and user land can write to it. And it can be used for privilege escalation. Unfortunately, using these different methods, we have multiple devices bricked. Are you ready for demo? No? Okay. So we are going to pass over a couple of our demos real quick until they are completely up and go into a few of the ways we actually obtained code execution without memory corruption. We have 4 different methods to obtain code execution without memory corruption. SCOMO, software management built in, more or less. Makes it easy. Not all devices have it, though. Then we have Chameleon. We can just rebrand applications, or rebrand devices with new apps. Intent proxies, pretty much by setting phone numbers and pushing files to the device, we can have it install APKs. And then just standard photo and firmware. You know, it depends on firmware checking of the device itself. Now, tactical exploitation. That's where it gets a lot more fun. You want to go into some of the details? So the types of vulnerabilities we actually found. On the clients that did not have the built-in functionality to install apps, which actually were a lot of them, we found a fairly significant set of memory corruption and related type vulnerabilities. Buffer overflows, heap corruption, integer overflows, format string issues, arbitrary reads, invalid freeze, and others. I'll let Mark go into our favorite vulnerability, reading memory.
Right. Yeah, we wanted to talk about the specific example because it's one of the most useful one of the most useful integer overflow we found for succeeding code execution on most devices. So this is an arbitrary read. This code you can see on the right is the code that parses the WB XML payload, which can contain numbers. And one of the functions that converts numbers into like a normal integer for the program, because they are like they have a different binary representation in WB XML, so there is some conversion. So the convert number translates this number, and in this specific case, this number is used to reference a string within one of the string table as the format accepts. So that's to facilitate to avoid more or less the duplication of strings. So you basically just have a reference, basically an offset of the base of the string table to the string you want to use. Within this specific code, when they retrieve the number and you have a malicious payload, you can see an integer overflow at the middle of the function here. They don't verify if the number is negative, for example. So this is an integer, signed integer, and it can wrap around, and you can bypass the first check that you can see here. And the data that you can read out of memory from the base of this buffer will be returned to you. And you can actually inject a lot of these arbitrary read within one payload and read most of the memory that is lower than the buffer. If you go to the next one. Okay. So we wanted to talk also about some issues we found, at least some weaknesses we found while we were testing and while we were doing the proof of concept and the exploits. Some of the things we found and that we used is that, so for example, on iOS, the memory large, so the malloc on iOS uses 3 different regions, tiny, small for like lower than 15 or 16 kilobytes, and they have one region per CPU, so basically have a lot of different regions for only one process, and it's hard to know where you can be on the heap, and it's hard to target specific memory regions. However, the malloc large region is always allocated at a similar place, and the memory allocation is relatively linear. It's also close to a lot of interesting data structures, as well as most of the stacks of the program. In addition, we found other different things related to memory protection that don't actually work, that the compiler adds, but it doesn't actually prevent anything, because there are some issues in the way it's done. Yeah, we have a lot of time, so I'm going to go through the next one.
Just read it. Quick.
All right, so we're going to talk about how we actually changed some of the issues to obtain code execution. The first step, I guess, for this attack is to bypass the authentication. So we send a WAP push with an AMI that is pushed to our BTS base station. So the client automatically sends its IMEI to the base station, so it's easy to calculate the authentication. And then if they use SSL, we can bypass it with a valid certificate signed for any host name, or just use the test server. We also found a few different issues while we were testing, but we don't really have time to talk about this in detail. Finding the memory corruption vulnerability is good. It's especially for low-level programs and program continuity. You can find a lot of them, but actually bypassing the exploit mitigation techniques implemented by the OS, especially on some specific platforms, as well as compiler mitigations, makes it way harder, obviously. While we were doing this, we found a few different issues, and we collected information on how to do that better. And especially seeing the number of platforms, we had to come up with different techniques. So in this specific case, we found ways to find the stack easily. For example, on iOS, I already mentioned it, the malloc large region is allocated close to the stack. And there are ways to more or less do heap grooming. So more or less you send requests that are actually going to allocate massive regions. Sometimes you can test requests that will leak data and that will allow you creating holes. So you can basically allow your buffer to be wherever you want. And wherever you want, close to a stack. Most of the stacks on iOS, at least within this program at least, were containing cookies a bit all over the place, and they were mostly at the same locations, so we were able to jump on them pretty easily. For Android, the issues within the platform we found were ISLR was pretty weak. We were able to jump on specific regions that were always more or less allocated at the same place due to the size of the buffer that was there. And we also found ways to find code sections. The program had a lot of pointers, function pointers, and we were able to map them back to the original, to the base of for example, on iOS, of the shared cache. So then we can continue the exploitation.
So I am going to change this over to our BTS to actually show you a demo, because we are just about out of time and haven't gotten to do any of the demos yet, so we would like to at least show us one. Okay. So this is actually, I think, our favorite demo. Hopefully it works. We are having some very odd technical difficulties. Now, so our demo device, I will try to pull up. I guess we don't have a way to show it. Oh, well, let's run it anyways, see what we can do. Anyways, we have a pretty much stock iPhone that we are trying to see if we can demonstrate code execution on. And it looks like we might be out of time. Aw. Oh, it's trying to run.
30 seconds.
We are not getting it. Networks aren't up. Well, looks like we can't do that demo right now. We are getting cut on time. I do not know why it's not connecting. Okay, let's see. Okay, well, so we apologize for the technical difficulties that we have been able to display. Appreciate you coming by, more or less.